management. He has number of publications to his credit and has won numerous awards and accolades, notable among which are Best BAAE PhD thesis in agricultural economics from 2006 to 2009, co-author of the best paper on the BAAE PhD workshop 2010 and again in 2018. Paper Award Editor's Choice in British Food Journal, promoter of Best BAAE PhD thesis in agricultural economics in the year 2011 to 2013, promoter of Krillon Award Master Thesis in 2013, Quality Research Publication in Social Sciences in 2013 by Bangladesh University Grant Commission, and Best Contributed Paper on EAA E-Congress in 2014. It's my privilege to request the learned professor to now come forward and enlighten us on the subject of his expertise. Professor Buysse.
Thank you for this introduction. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay, thank you. My biggest award actually is something that just recently happened, and it's also not my own work, but I was very happy with it that one of the former PhD students that I supervised is now Minister of Agriculture. So he will have real life impact with decisions. Minister of Agriculture in his home country, with more agricultural holdings than any country in the EU. So yeah, I think that's a nice achievement of him. And I'm a little bit proud of having been part of his training. Now, I'm not so much familiar with all of you. So I prepared some slides, but I really have no idea how much background people of you have in trade modeling or in mathematical programming, or what level of econometrics you all had. So I made a presentation that is, I think, rather basic. So for some of you, this will be very easy or boring. Nevertheless, maybe you can give me some feedback whether I can do the teaching better or not. But before you start, just to give me an idea, I don't know if people can respond in the chat or just open their microphone. Who is currently doing trade modeling? Is there anybody doing trade modeling? So if any, just write in the chat, yeah, I do trade modeling, and then maybe you open your microphone and then you say what research question you deal with trade modeling. I see nobody reacting. Is it because nobody is doing trade modeling, or everybody is shy?
Sir, trade modeling is new concept for us. So very few people are working on trade modeling currently.
Okay, good. Then I'll keep it, then it's good that my presentation will be very basic. And then I'll just open my PowerPoint. Can you see this one?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just have to make sure that I also keep the chat open. Can you repeat? So somebody asked to repeat the question, whether, yeah, so my question was whether somebody was doing trade modeling, but I hear that most of you are not trade modeling. So I'll directly go to the papers that I briefly will discuss with you. And so these are papers where I've been involved. And then, of course, I have a bit more background to talk about them. And based on the titles, you can derive what it is about. So the first paper from 2012, the lead author was Stefan Nolte, was modeling the effects of the abolition of the EU sugar quota on internal prices in the EU, the production in the EU, and imports. So basically, within the EU, in 2006, they decided we need to do a reform of our sugar policy because there was it was not WTO compliant, so there was some export subsidies, and there were some complaints from other countries, and the WTO ruled on that case, and they said, yeah, the EU, your policy is not okay, so you need to change it. The EU made a change, and before the EU production and trade of sugar, so raw sugar, refined sugar, either on sugar, based on sugar beets or on sugar cane, was very protected. And then they decided we will drastically change it. And what Stefan, me, and my former promoter tried to do is try to assess now if suddenly export subsidies are abolished, import tariffs decline, what will happen with the world trade of sugar quota? A similar question could now happen with, I guess you're all aware of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and that gave a drastic shock in trade of, for instance, energy products, because suddenly the EU says we will not export basic commodities to Russia anymore, and Russia decided, okay, then we will also not export, or actually the EU also decided we will not buy the same amount of gas and oil from Russia. So that is a shock to the economy, a shock that is policy driven or war driven, however you call it. War is also a policy choice, I think. So what people now can think of is what will happen, because the gas in Russia is still there, the oil is still there, it will not be transported to Europe, it will flow somewhere else in trade. And the approach that we followed here is a kind of advanced version of a spatial price equilibrium model. And a spatial price equilibrium model, that is a technique that has been developed or proposed already in the 60s. So a very old technique. We changed it a little bit, and during the presentation of today, the objective is to illustrate what is the difference with that approach and the approach that has been used in this paper here, the paper with Jan Brusselaars, who is currently a professor, also a former PhD student, but he's currently professor at the University of Amsterdam, and he analyzed no, actually, I should talk about the third paper. He analyzed the implementation of a voluntary partnership agreement policy between EU and Cameroon. So the EU is making now bilateral trade agreements, and they try to do that with Cameroon, and they say, okay, once we have this this agreement, free trade of products will take place. But, said the EU, we also would like that you, Cameroon, take efforts to reach some of the marketing requirements that in the EU we impose. Marketing requirements where we will help you, that's then from the EU to Cameroon to reach it. But for instance, the EU claimed to be a bit restrictive, or at least does not state that does not want to import wood from African or other countries that is illegally harvested. So if wood is traded from Cameroon to Europe, They want to have a due diligence system, a system that makes sure that this wood is controlled, that it is harvested in a proper way. So in this paper, we followed a completely different approach for modeling trade than the approach that we followed in the first and in the second paper. So the objective of today is to illustrate where are the differences, but most of the explanation will be on the first approach. But to explain it, I have to go back. I have to explain some of the basic methodology, the core methodology that is driving this this analysis, and that is mathematical programming. First question: who is familiar with mathematical programming? You can just write in the chat, I am, or yes, or no, not at all. I've heard about it. Who is familiar with mathematical programming as an economic technique, research technique, or research method? Okay. One person is. Okay, some people have basic knowledge, not much. Good, then I'll explain the very basics of mathematical programming. And the very basics of mathematical programming are not really limited to applications in trade modeling. If we use this type of things, so we use our smartphones, and I guess most of you will also use smartphones for navigation, for going from one place to the other. I don't know which app you use to do that. That is also a kind of mathematical programming application, but it's programmed into the software, so we don't have to care about it. But the bottom line, the mathematics behind it is mathematical programming. So what is mathematical programming? It's a technique consisting, well, it has two words, mathematical and programming. And program does not refer to computer programming, it refers to finding a possible set of decisions. So if we have many decisions that we can take, program is the objective to look at what are the possible decisions that we have to take. Mathematical is the technique of calculation that we use to find from all these possible decisions the best one. So the objective of mathematical programming is finding the optimal solution to problems. And in all these problems, there is typically an objective function which reflects the decision rule that is simulated, and constraints that reflect the limited resources. So why is mathematical programming relevant for policy analysis or for trade analysis and for management and in economics in general? Because the fundamental economic problem is actually trying to make the best use of limited resources. So we have limited resources, we have a certain objective, we want to make the best use of it, and mathematical programming will help us. It's also a good combination with a lot of economic theory. In EU foreign policy analysis, it's also handy because in EU foreign policy analysis, there's often farm-specific ceilings, production quota that you can easily implement in mathematical programming models, but it's also used sometimes for bioeconomic modeling, where you have both economic elements and biophysical and ecological elements. So this close link between economic model elements and real world constraints also makes it easier to understand what mathematical models do. But to understand it better, let's go to some mathematical notation here. So what is a typical example is that we have an objective function, we maximize something, our objective z, for instance, and this could be the sum of different activities that we can produce, each with a gross margin. And that objective function is subject to a set of constraints where B reflects our resource availabilities, and A is then how much resources are required to produce one unit of an activity J, And we can then have I different resources. To put it a bit more specific, this is an example of a mathematical programming model. Very simple example. So where we have, for instance, a farm with two activities, X1 and X2. And I'm sorry to choose now a Western European example, but you will easily translate it to other parts in the world. Imagine that X1 and X2 are the amount of, for instance, X1, the hectares of potatoes that you produce, and X2, the hectares of wheat that you produce. And so potatoes, the root crop, wheat, the cereal crop. And imagine you have a farm with 120 hectares of land. And of course, if you mathematically represent your farm, how much hectares of wheat and how much hectares of potatoes you produce should be lower than 120. You also have some labor. Imagine that you have 320 days of labor throughout a year, and that to produce this wheat and potatoes, for the potatoes you need 4 days of labor, and for the wheat you need 2 days of labor. And both of them together should be lower than 320. So mathematical programming, you put that in software. Excel is available. There's libraries in R, in Python. I typically use GAMS. It's quite commonly used in agriculture economics environment to program your models, feed it to algorithms that solve it, and they will give you results. So most people that develop models, use the models and see the results, you rely on software solving the model. Because indeed, I don't know if anybody of you tried already to directly calculate the solution to this problem, even though it looks very simple. Calculating just and solving it as one system of equations is not possible. And because this is a maximization and these are inequalities. So this is not a system of equation that you can directly solve. There's no direct analytical solution to it. So you need to go to a wider set of constraints or to specific algorithms to solve it. The simplex algorithm is one of them. Another way to do it is to solve it in a graphical way. And people in practice never do that. Nevertheless, I will just show you how you solve that problem here in a graphical way. Why? Because at least I understand things better if I can represent them in graphs and figures, and if I can represent the solution of this model in a graphical way, I will easier understand what actually mathematical programming does. So if you allow me, we go now through a graphical solution to this mathematical programming model. By the way, if anybody has a question, don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask, or to write in the chat. I'm following the chat. If you have a question, you don't understand something, I will directly try to follow and answer. If you think, hey, this is too boring, we know this already, this is too simplistic what you explained, you can also tell me, then I will go a bit quicker over this information. But I see no reaction, so I'll just continue on the pace I'm going right now. So imagine we want to solve that setting in a graphical way. What we will do is, we make a graph here. By the way, I need to make sure that I have the pointer. Yeah, you see the red dot moving there? I guess so. On the screen, can you follow my, if I show something on the...
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So as a start, we just plot this white area with our two axes. So these are, at this moment, all our possible decisions that we can take. So if we choose this dot here, where the current dot is now, that would represent with this amount of x1 and this amount of x2. But of course, our choices of how much wheat and how much potatoes for X1 and X2 we choose is not unlimited. We are limited by our constraints. So one of our constraints is our land constraint. Our land constraint is 120. So if we only produce X1, we cannot go beyond this point, because then indeed we use all of our 120 hectares of land. If we only produce X2, we cannot go beyond this point, because then we use all of our land. Now the constraint is linear, so we have two dots on our straight line. We can draw our straight line through it. So this is our land constraint. So that means that from all possible decisions, the ones that are here are not feasible choices because they are above our land constraint. So we need to stay on or lower than this constraint. We can now do the same with our labor constraint. We put 80 hectares of X1. Why? Because we have 320 days of labor. We need 4 days for 1 hectare of X1. So 40 times 80 is 320. So given our available labor, we cannot go beyond this point here, the 80. We can also not go beyond the point of 160 if we would only produce X2 given our labor constraint. Now this is our labor constraint. Sorry, the drawing is not perfect. It needs to go to that point here, the 160. But the bottom line is we have to stay below both of our constraints. So this is what we call the feasible solution space. So these are all possible decisions in this green shaded area. These are all possible solutions that we can take, and that will respect our land constraint and our labor constraint. Now, we economists, by the way, this is the programming part of mathematical programming. We have now listed all possible solutions that we can take. But from all these possible solutions, we also want to have the best one. So that's the mathematical part. We want to now look at, what is now bringing us the highest return that we defined in our objective function. And we economists, we like to put isolines. And isolines are lines where each point on the line has the same value. So we could, for instance, put an isoprofit line of 400. So each point on that red line gives us an isoprofit of 400. And why is that? It is because if you cultivate 10 hectares of X1, somebody asked, is this linear programming? Yes, we are here giving a specific example of linear programming. So if we want to produce 400 and we had a gross margin of 40 per hectare of X1, then we get 400 with 10 hectares of X1. We can get also 400 by having 30.3 of X2. Now our profit is a linear function, so all points on this line, so we connect the two dots, give us the same profit of 400. So this green space we can subdivide in an infinite number of isoprofit lines that are all parallel with each other. And the further this isoprofit line goes away from the origin, the higher the isoprofit line would be. So the objective is now to look at the isoprofit line that is as far as possible away from the origin, with at least 1 point within the feasible solution space. And this is this point. Okay. And if we would have made our distance is correct, then we would be able to derive, okay, this is nicely in the middle. These distances are equal. So if this is 80, this should be 40. And then these distances, it's also in the middle somewhere. So this should be half of 160 is 80. So the optimal solution, giving us a profit of 4,000, will be 40 hectares of X1 and 80 hectares of X2. Now my question is, if we go back to the slide, imagine that the gross margin here of X1 changes and is not 40 anymore, but it becomes 80. How does the graph change? And what is the optimal solution? So the objective function is not 40x1, 30x2, it is 80x1 plus 30x2. Does anybody know the answer? You can put it in the chat or open your microphone and just shout it out. Meanwhile, I drink a bit of coffee. Somebody sends me a direct message, but it's not the feasible area will not increase. We change our objective function. It's not our constraints that we change the objective function. So I'll go a bit back. So we change this one from 40 to 80.
Isoprofit curve will shift upward?
Yes, indeed. The isoprofit function will shift. And it will shift in such a way that we can now reach the same profit with lower X2. So it actually, and then you say upwards, yeah, so the slope will become flatter. Okay. So the isoprofit line will be a bit more like this. Not horizontal, but a bit like this. Now, if you then move that parallel isoprofit function away from the origin, you will now find the isoprofit line with the highest profit not anymore in this point, but in this point. So at this corner point solution. And that is now typical of mathematical or linear programming. And linear programming is a specific type of mathematical programming where most of your constraints or where all your constraints and objectives are linear. And that is now typical with linear programming, is that you end up in corner point solutions. So if you play a little bit with your gross margins or with your isoprofit line a little bit, if it stays within the slopes of these two constraint lines, your optimal point will not change. It stays here. But if it changes more significantly, suddenly, first, it will become parallel to this line, and then any point from here to here would give us the same profit. So whether we have now this amount of, so 80 hectares of X2, or that would be here maybe 60 hectares of X2, or 80 hectares of X1, it would not make a difference in profit. But then if the slope goes a bit further, so if in other words X1 becomes more profitable, the prices become higher, suddenly the model advises you not to do this anymore, but go to this corner point solution. So corner point solutions is something very typical with linear programming. And that is the objective of explaining this to you in a graphical way, because at least for me, then I remember that easier, and I indeed understand, okay, actually, if we deal with linear programming, we are often in these corner point solution with not a lot of change, and then suddenly could be a jump from one situation to the other.
Sir, Does corner point solution means we are producing only one product or we are using only one input?
So here we are, it's a very simple model. We just choose the products X1 and X2. So in this, it's also a corner. I call it a corner because it is here on the corner of these two lines. Here we produce two products, X1 and X2. But here we end up in producing only X1, and here we would end up producing only X2. But of course, in real life models, yeah, the number of variables increases, and then yeah, it's not necessarily that we have only one non-zero variable, so we can have multiple, but yeah, I don't know if people, yeah, if you, I guess a lot of you will also use from time to time navigation apps. And I don't know which one you are using, but I'm using from time to, and I don't give any advertisement here because I have no shares or interest in the company, but it's a very common one. So I use Google Maps for navigation. Also when I'm cycling or driving a car. In some areas, at least, there's a live traffic information, and if I pass a road, it sometimes tells me, yeah, here is an alternative, or there is an alternative based on the traffic. Now, so for instance, if I want to go from my home place to the capital city of Belgium and Europe, and Brussels, it will send me mostly over Ghent. But sometimes there's traffic because there's an accident happening and so on, and then it takes that into account. But if the traffic is only a little bit, it will still send me over Ghent. But if the traffic really extends, suddenly the navigation app will tell me, well, now going through Ghent or going through Antwerp, which is quite completely different place, is the same time. And then if it's a bit longer, then it suddenly switches to the solution of Antwerp. That is actually this jumpy behavior from one choice to the other that is typical outcome, and it also makes sense. It's a pure rational optimization, mathematical optimization of this mathematical programming models. So now we get the basics of what they do and how they function. Maybe let's go back to where they are applied. So mathematical programming, or the specific version with only linear constraints, is standard in blending problems. Blending problem in agriculture, at least, so for instance, in Northwestern Europe, the livestock industry is very important, and for livestock you need feed, or also for human diets. Yeah, if you want to have a certain dietary objectives, that can be your objective at the cheapest cost, or that can be your constraints. I want to have a minimum amount of protein, a minimum amount of this amount of amino acid, a minimum amount of this fatty acid, this fatty acid, and I want to choose between, I don't know, rice, millet, sorghum, I don't know, cassava, corn, cotton seeds. I mean, whatever you can get nutritional value on, which of this combination is now the cheapest blend that will satisfy my requirements, nutritional requirements, and how much should I use from each one that give me the cheapest price. But the lecture about today is more on transportation models. So most international logistic companies, if they optimize how much we should ship from one place to the other, they use mathematical or linear programming models. And so they decide now, is it better to ship from this place to that place, or from that place to that place, and how much? And which combination gives me the cheapest outcome? Also others where you have to produce or when you have to produce are typical applications of mathematical programming. Now coming back to our duality, I'll explain later. I first want to go back to how does this now all relate to our trade model. Takayama and Judge in 1962 wrote a book about it, and they called it Spatial Price Equilibrium. Yeah, MP, sorry, indeed, I should write that in full. MP denotes mathematical programming. So they defined that trade is actually a kind of transport problem. And transport problems, if there's one decision maker or within a company, you could make the decision based on a mathematical programming model. Now, what if we assume that there's the invisible hand and everybody acts rational and prices are the signals that drives people and everybody is minimizing cost? Then we can also assume that trade will happen according to what is the cheapest cost for everybody? And how much is transported from one place to another place? Transported, thus also traded, depends on where it is produced, where there is demand, so the supply in different places, the demand in different places, and the transport cost, or transport distances, or distances translated into costs. So if we have, we can think of any commodity, but if we think about sugar, we have sugar production in Europe, we have sugar production in Brazil, we have it in Thailand, and then there's sugar demand in Europe, there's sugar demand in the Americas, there's sugar demand in Africa, and then of course in our sugar model we have more supply places and more demand places. And then you can simulate. Now, if you would minimize the cost of transport, for instance, makes most sense that the Brazilian sugar stays in Latin America because that's the cheapest, and the surplus, so from supply 1 to demand 1, the surplus of the Brazilian sugar goes first to its closest neighbors, maybe the USA, and then maybe to Europe. Unless Europe puts here a high cost, an import tariff. So this import tariff you build also into your mathematical transport problem. And this is how you basically simulate trade. So the Takayama and Judge approach is simulating trade as a transport problem specified as a mathematical or a linear programming model. Now, this has advantages and disadvantages of doing it. I don't know, does anybody, maybe you have now already, it rings a bell, or people have done similar research. Does anybody has an idea what would be the advantage or what would be a disadvantage of simulating trade based on such an approach, where you purely look at transport costs, how much and where there's supply available, how much and where there's demand available, and then you see how the trade will, in an optimal, mathematical optimal way, would happen. And if you do that to simulate how trade flows will take place, what are advantages and what are the disadvantages? And the same you can just write in the chat, or you can open your microphone and just share it. Okay, I see no reaction. Well, if you do it this way, so you simulate trade as a transport model driven by a mathematical programming model with linear constraints, with linear objective function, then you have the same jumpy behavior. Yeah, somebody opened the microphone, but I didn't hear so clearly.
Sir, it gives flexibility in decision making.
It assumes that there is a single decision maker. Yes, and in reality, that's not the case. So in reality, there's multiple decision makers, and in this case, it assumes there's a single decision maker. But this single decision maker is basically, yeah, as if you have in a perfect market, what would be the outcome? So what we refer to Adam Smith, the invisible hand. But for instance, what you in the outcome, so if you run that type of model, what you would see that, for instance, if we think about sugar and one is Brazil, and then Brazil is supplying, I don't know, for instance, Saudi Arabia, at a certain moment, because the transport costs are, and the production costs and transport costs are cheaper. So currently there's Saudi Arabia. And here number 2 is, for instance, India or Thailand. I'm not sure. I think Thailand is a bigger sugar producer than India. It's a while ago that I looked at the statistics, but maybe not a bigger sugar producer, but at least a bigger exporter. I'm not sure. If somebody knows that I'm wrong, you can. I'm happy to be corrected in the chat or so. Now, if suddenly there's a small shift in prices, it can happen that the simulation model will say, now Saudi Arabia will take no sugar at all anymore from Brazil, and all of its sugar will now come from India. And we know that in practice, this not always works like that. So that trade flows suddenly completely shift because, yeah, trade is also driven by human interactions. And so knowledge, networks, language, infrastructure, long-term contracts all play a role. So that sudden jumpy behavior that you get as an output of a mathematical programming model is not there in reality. Also, a lot of trading countries or companies tend to diversify a little bit to spread risks. I mean, I don't know if you follow the current political developments, but in Europe now there's a lot of fuss about that Europe did not sufficiently diversify with its energy input. And so some people are arguing that this winter it will be cold here, but yeah, I think it will be okay. We just take an extra sweater and a hat and we will survive it. But the thing is so to prevent a situation that suddenly one of your trading partners, for whatever reason, you're not interacting with that one anymore. So in the case between the EU and Russia for the gas deliveries because of war, so EU doesn't want anymore and Russia doesn't want, so there's a big conflict. To prevent that situation, you tend to diversify already in advance. So that's a logic thing. And this is not something that naturally comes out of mathematical programming models or this typical trade as transport problem models. And that is actually what the innovative part of let me go back to the paper of this paper is, because here we try to introduce a calibration step. So you don't have a simple transport model. No, now you also add a calibration step to it and nonlinear terms to deal a little bit with this fact that countries diversify trade. So to explain you that, so why do we add a calibration step and what is a calibration step? I first need to explain you what is calibration of mathematical programming models. So let's continue and now go to calibration of mathematical programming models. No, I'll do that after I do the explanation of the duality. So I'll first explain duality, and then we do calibration of mathematical programming models. But again, duality of mathematical programming, or duality in linear programming model, or the Karush-Kuhn-Tucker conditions. Does that ring a bell for some of you? Shadow prices. So you can just say, yes, it rings a bell, or I know what it is, or I have heard about it.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, so one person, or do you speak in for everybody? You think that everybody knows this? So yeah, there's no reaction. So I assume if there's no reaction, then I heard from one person, yes, so that person, or at least one person amongst you know this, so I assume the others don't. So I'll try to explain what is duality in the context of mathematical programming. So every mathematical programming model that is specified like this, you can specify an equivalent one, a copy, where the objective is not to maximize profit, but now to find the shadow prices of the fixed resources. And we look for, that's what we call dual value shadow prices. So we look for the shadow prices of the fixed resources in such a way that the shadow prices cover our gross margin. So if this is our primal model, the one that we specify and that we actually want to solve in our farm, we want to maximize our profit, considering our land constraint, considering our labor constraint, then there exists always another model that tells us what is now the value of the resource land and what is the value of the resource labor, U1 and U2, such that it covers our gross margin here. Okay. In most cases, if you use software like some libraries in R or Python or Excel, even Excel has this pre-programmed. Okay, yeah. So we know you all. You all know duality and you all know Kuhn-Tucker conditions. That is correct. Then I can go a bit quicker over this, because then you know that for every constraint, we have also a shadow price. And then in our trade model, and that's a nice thing, I'll do not explain this more in detail. For our trade model, does not only say how much we transport from one place to the other, the arrows in this graph, but it also gives us the shadow prices. So the price of the product at the place where it's transported from and the price of the product where it's arriving. So from the dual values, we can derive the prices of the products in the different places. Okay. So that's the concept of duality. Now we move to the concept of calibration. Calibration of mathematical programming models. So why has this been introduced? In most cases, if you use linear programming or mathematical programming, we do not calibrate. We just say, okay, we develop a model and we use it to advise somebody what to do. So for instance, with our navigation app, we use our navigation app to get advice. How should we go from place A to place B? Now, there's other situations where we use models with a mathematical programming engine not really to advise somebody what to do, but to mimic her or his rationality behavior. So if we assume that people rationally move from one place to the other, then we can also use our navigation app, for instance, to simulate how traffic flows would change if there's certain road works or there's a roadblock, because we assume that everybody will rationally adjust her or his travel route to minimize their transport time. And if everybody is using this navigation app, that is also a reasonable assumption, because that navigation app tells us in a rational way how to go from place A to place B. The same we can think about trade. So we can assume that if everybody uses quite sophisticated models to analyze where should we now trade or how should we ship our products, and use potentially software to support this decision, and it's a rational decision, then we can assume, okay, if we want to simulate how trade flows will change because of a new policy or international friction or whatever, import tariff, export subsidies, then we can simulate that with a mathematical programming engine. The key thing is that sometimes these models do not really reproduce what you observe. They are not what is called in model terminology calibrated. They are not calibrated. So in policy models, in agriculture economics literature, they came up with calibration of programming models. They did already some types of calibrations in the 80s and in the 90s, but it became very popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, where agricultural mathematical programming models used for policy analysis were calibrated to simulate how farmers would adjust to new prices, for instance, or to new quota. Now, the paper of Nolte, me and my promoter, introduces this calibration into trade models. And now there's a couple of other authors doing that. So recently, I saw a paper from Janssens on simulating the free trade area in Africa. And this was also done with a calibrated mathematical programming model for simulating the trade aspect. So, but what is that, this calibration, and how does it work? So if we advise people what to do, what we do is we define our model, we make an objective function, we make our constraints, and then we find our optimal solution. That's how linear programming or mathematical programming is most cases used. However, if we want to describe what our people are doing, we want to describe how the trade will happen, we assume that the current observed trade is optimal. And then we define some functional form, just as we do in a stochastic frontier analysis or a data, not in a data development analysis, but in a stochastic frontier analysis. We set a calibration technique, and then we find the model parameter. So we add, how it's explained in the paper that I cited in the beginning, we add quadratic terms to our trade parameters. So for instance, if Saudi Arabia is sourcing sugar not only from Thailand because it's the closest and the cheapest, but to spread its risk, it's also sourcing it a bit from Brazil. Then we add unobserved costs such that our current trade flows are reproduced in our model. So the objective is now that we assume the current situation is optimal for all decision makers, otherwise they wouldn't have chosen what they did, and we find their behavioral parameters. And once we have their behavioral parameters, we define a model that we then use to further simulate. So that's what we do with calibration of mathematical programming. Graphically, how this looks is that in a linear programming solution, it could be that we define, and this is again this is our solution space, this is our feasible solution space. Everything within is possible solution. With a linear profit function, we might have to end up in A, but we do not observe A, we observe this dot. Okay, so actually, if we do not have a calibrated model, our model, if we run it for our baseline conditions, it might completely not reproduce what we currently observe. What we do if we calibrate it and we use this descriptive mathematical programming is that we observe something, we define a nonlinear profit function or nonlinear objective function, we fit it, so we adjust our parameters until it fits our observed situation, and once we have it, then we can still change things in our model to do policy simulation. So that's basically what we do in calibrated mathematical programming. Now, so to repeat it, if we advise people, we do not have calibration, we do not necessarily reproduce what we observe. We also do not need base data. We just assume this is what people do, this is how the system works, and we run what happens. While with calibration, we adjust our parameters of our objective function such that it reproduces our objective function. Going back to our 3 papers that I explained in the very beginning. So what we did here in this paper is, okay, we will simulate sugar trade in the world. So what we did is look at what is the supply of sugar in the main suppliers in Brazil, Thailand, Europe, US, Russia, and so on and so on. Then we looked at where is there demand for sugar, and now is what are the current trade flows. Then we had observations of freight rates. And so how much does it cost to have one ship going from one place to another? So that is the real observed cost. The unobserved cost is that there may be unobserved insurances or diversification patterns. So we added unobserved costs, so to calibrate our model. Once it's calibrated and we reproduce baseline data, then we give the model a shock by, for instance, in this case, removing the sugar quota, which in the end has been implemented in 2000. What was it, 17 or 18 in the EU. What will happen with EU production? What will happen with import, export, and trade in the rest of the world? Okay, so that was the approach. Why did we apply here a completely different approach than the approach that we applied there, where we used a purely econometric approach? And this whole program, I've been informed, is mostly econometric. Is that correct? I assume it isn't. So most of you are already specialized in econometrics. So with econometrics, what you do is you get data from the case study that you want to analyze, and then you make a model that predicts your dependent based on some independence. So for instance, your dependent would be how much trade is going from one country to the other. And independence could be different parameters explaining it. If it's time series, could be past observations, could be tariffs that play a role, could be distances that play a role, and so on. And so once you have estimated your model, you can change something and simulate what would happen if you change, for instance, import tariff. So here we applied purely the econometric approach. Here we applied purely, not purely, here we applied the calibrated mathematical approach. And here we applied the non-calibrated mathematical programming approach. So why? I mean, you see, there's the same author involved in the 3 papers. Why does one author use 3 different methodologies into trade problems? That is the key thing that I would like to explain to you. Why do I choose for one model in that situation and another approach in another situation? So why do I choose for an approach with a mathematical programming model for sugar and wood in these cases, well, here we are looking at worldwide trade. Here we are looking at trade where decisions are taken rather rational. In this case, and in this research question, we are looking at cases where trade shifts also in the past happened quite suddenly. So what you also see now, for instance, with the international shakeup of some political tensions, yeah, the sudden shift, if you would look at year statistics, the sudden shift of the amount of gas exports from Russia or oil exports from Russia to Europe to other places, that is not just a smooth change along a quadratic estimated trade function that you would obtain with an econometric model, where quadratic or logarithmic or translog functions typically show smooth changes, not sudden changes. And sometimes in commodities, especially if there's a big shock, there can also be big changes in commodity trade. And that is, for instance, what at least I think currently is happening in a lot of commodities. I talk about gas, but it's also for oil, it's also for wheat, rice, and so on. So really, I mean, quite rational. If for instance, there's an LNG transport going to China, they suddenly see, the price is better in Europe, whoop, they go to Europe. So then a mathematical programming model makes sense. Why do I, in this case, this is about trade of wood, because it's a paper in the Journal of Forest Policy and Economics. Why do I assume here this sudden shift is not taking place? Well, in this paper, we try to understand a little bit more of the less tangible aspects of trade. So in the case of trade, you have decisions taken, for instance, the European Union deciding, okay, at this moment, from then on, we don't want any coal or gas or oil. No, gas is not forbidden yet, but we don't want any coal and then oil anymore coming from Russia to the EU. That is a sudden change. But there are some nuances, because often before such a change is decided, there's discussions about it. Once it's decided, there's also a transition period. And what happens in the before the decision, during the decision period, and after is sometimes very interesting to analyze and to look at how it happened. So for instance, in the case of this paper, we wanted to see how this negotiation, agreement, and implementation between an agreement between one specific country and a trade bloc, so Cameroon and the EU, and they negotiated on some kind of agreement on trade. They first negotiated, then they said, okay, we agreed, and this is how it's going to look like. Then there's a transition period, and then it's implemented. And you see that there's very interesting changes happening based on anticipation of traders. And actually, you also see that now in energy markets in the EU. So the EU said, we will not trade any coal anymore from Russia. Can anybody guess what happened the months before the decision was implemented? It's exactly also what we describe here. So they decide we will not trade anymore with Russia. Here they decided, we will trade with Cameroon, but we will apply more strict control and rules. What happens in the month or 2 months before? Anybody has an idea what would happen? Not yet. Well, there's anticipation, because traders then see, Now we still have the context. Now we still have the opportunity. Then it will not be there. Prices will be more expensive. Let's suddenly transport more, trade more, build up stocks, and then later you see a decline in trade. Now, this type of patterns over time, especially between two countries, yeah, you cannot capture that with mathematical programming models because this is on anticipative behavior. It's not pure, it is rational, but the rationality behind it is too complex to quantify that within the objective function of a spatial price equilibrium model. So that's why we chose here to look at a time series econometric model to see whether there are structural breaks corresponding with the times of the certain decisions taking place. So what is now the difference between those two papers? In this paper, we used a non-calibrated model, and in this paper we used a calibrated model. Why do we choose here a non-calibrated model, and why do we choose here a calibrated model? Now, in this paper, we really had the objective, because we had very detailed data on transport and so on. We did not only want to show the mechanism, we also wanted to make some actual predictions of trade volumes and actual prices taking place after this quota abolition. While here, we did not have any, because the data were not there, we did not have any detailed, accurate data on wood. The main thing of the main objective of the paper was to show what are the mechanisms playing. So the research question is completely different. Here, the research question is clearly, yes?
दो ढाई बजे से क्लास छोड़ी मैंने
Yeah, the connection was not so good, so I didn't understand what you said.
So just disturbances, nothing else, sir.
Excuse me?
It was disturbance, sir.
Ah, okay. So I just continue. So the difference between this one and this one is that here we actually wanted to show if it's really the objective to reproduce what you see and to make actual predictions on prices and production volume, then indeed calibrating makes quite a lot of sense. However, if you want to just show the mechanisms that play, assuming that everybody acts rational, assuming that there's different supply and demand functions, and in this case we wanted to look at differences between green public procurement and not, then actually just a model with a mechanistic simulation might be sufficient. So basically these are the reasons why we choose for a calibrated mathematical programming model, a non-calibrated mathematical programming model, and a purely econometric model. This is, in short, what I wanted to share about the differences and the approaches. Is this clear for everybody? Could everybody follow? Are there comments, questions? I see no comments or questions. So either this was entirely clear or not at all, I don't know. Or maybe, yeah, relevant or not relevant for you. I finished way within the time. Yeah, I had foreseen a bit, slack time to potentially answer questions or further clarifications or elaborate more on certain aspects. Yes, so my email. So somebody asks to send the email. So my email is this, but your head of department knows that I'm not always so responsive on emails because I receive, yeah, maybe it's a cheap excuse. I receive sometimes too much, but yeah, don't hesitate to send a second time, and if time, I surely will try to respond to it.
Sir, I have a question. May I ask?
Of course.
Sir, if we are dealing with a dual problem, then it is cost minimization, isn't it? If the maximization problem is profit maximization, then when we are in dual, we want to know how less resources we can use to get that level of profit, isn't it, sir?
That is correct. Yeah. Yeah. So if your primal problem is a maximization, your dual problem is a minimization, and the other way around. So if your primal problem is a minimization, your dual is a maximization.
So accordingly, the subject to, that is the constraints, will change, because in the maximization problem, our constraints was we are constrained with the given resources, and in case of the minimization problem, we are restricting the amount of minimum profits acceptable. So accordingly, our constraint function becomes a greater than equal to instead of less than equal to. Isn't it, sir?
Yeah, that is correct. Yes.
So how can we solve that? In that case, how can we solve that?
Well, in most cases, it is, yeah, it's not a really issue for the researcher. So the researcher specifies in the software, for instance, the software that I use, and yeah, also again, I have no shares of the company, but it's commercial software at this moment. I use this software. It's in the chat. You specify your problem how you want. So either you specify your primal problem, and then the software itself will translate it into the dual. And it calculates them both at the same time. By the way, Excel also does it. So actually, it's not really a concern for you. However, sometimes it's more convenient and more efficient, and we did that actually in this paper, to directly specify it into the optimality conditions, the Tucker conditions, especially if you want to feed it to an MCP. I also write in the chat, the MCP solver for a mixed complementary problem. So then you actually define your Tucker conditions, and the model or the software solves the Tucker conditions. And in that paper, this is the approach we did, because actually, now it becomes a bit technical. If you add some of the non-tariff barriers that were there in the European trade policy, you cannot specify them anymore within a linear or mathematical programming. That's why we do it like that. But yeah, actually, for the researcher, this is the least of her or his concerns, because you just specify it, put it in the software, and it comes out. The key thing is that you need to understand what does this shadow price mean? What does it reflect from your dual solution that you get with your primal, or the other way around? So in the case of trade models, the shadow prices reflect price differences, and then you also see that's why it's called a spatial price equilibrium model. You see the differences in prices for the commodity that you're simulating, and you see why trade costs explain that prices of certain commodities might be different in different regions. Again, I'm a bit less familiar with the agricultural markets of India and neighboring countries than most of you are. But for instance, I assume that without intervention, rice prices in India are lower than some of its neighbors. Though, yeah. Say
Sir,
lower than the MENA countries in any case, because
yes, sir.
India was a net is or was a net extra exporting country. Other questions?
Sir, is it required free trade is necessary to apply this model? Because if we if we have restricted trade, can we apply this kind of model, or we need to assume that free trade is the primal condition here?
No, that is exactly the thing. At least that's my opinion. With restricted trade, applying these models are interesting because I didn't follow all international discussions yet, but what quite often happens is that governments intervene, and an intervention can be quite abrupt, can have a quite strong effect at the short term. And that is exactly because in linear programming, your constraint is binding or non-binding. And that's why this is quite accurately reflected within your linear programming based trade models. So restricted trade, I mean, I'm talking then on export restrictions because of an export ban or import tariffs or export quota or things like that. These are, that's what I think, quite accurately or spatial price equilibrium based models, so with a mathematical programming engine inside, basically are quite good at reproducing this type of trade. So yeah, trade restrictions. Yeah, if I now again focus on the talk of the day, at least in Europe, the gas export from Russia to Europe, if Russia suddenly decides, no, we cut our exports, that is a sudden trade restriction between two trading partners. But that does not restrict the trade between Russia and China, Russia and India. And what you really will expect is that part of that trade that happens between Russia and the EU will flow elsewhere. And that will be, at least in a period of a year, a big shift in trade. And that big shift in trade, I personally think that this type of shifts are most accurately simulated with spatial price equilibrium models that do have a linear programming or mathematical programming engine inside. That's how we call it, and mathematical programming engine inside. So I think with current international climate, I refer all the time to gas, but there's other commodities that really see shocks, big shocks in trade interventions by governments. I do think that if anybody of you is interested in simulating trade of commodities at this moment and what will happen with current developments, then it's interesting to look at it.
Sir, how can we incorporate the restrictions in the modeling? That is, when we are modeling trade, preparing the trade modeling, do we have to put more constraints in terms of restriction? How can we model these restrictions?
Well, so if I go back to this, no, I have to go forward now. If I go back to the graphical representation of our trade model. So this is a graphical representation of what we could put in our linear programming model. So we have a supply, we have a demand, and now we minimize our transport costs. So we minimize our transport costs, and there will be for each supply place and for each demand, there will be a quantity that will be one of our constraints. So the constraints of this model, if we now would all together define what is the model, we would have an objective function summing up and minimizing the sum of the costs of every source to every destination multiplied with how much we ship. And the shipments, this is our decision variable. Now, so we have then for every combination source destination a decision variable. So if we simulate trade worldwide and we have, for instance, 20 trade blocks and they all are a source and a destination, then we simulate potential the amount of trade from one place to the other times all combinations. For each source and destination, we then have also a quantity restriction. We say that the amount that we ship from here, now we can either choose the quantities as being fixed or also being driven by a supply function, a local supply function and a local demand function. Then we are in a more partial equilibrium setting. But if we limit the quantity here, the quantity that we have here limits how much we export here, here, and here. So the sum of this arrow plus this arrow plus this arrow should not be greater than this amount.
Okay.
So imagine that S1 is now take another example, Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine is a big producer of sunflower seeds or wheat, because wheat that is also very relevant in India. So Ukraine is very important exporter of wheat. If Ukraine suddenly, well, maybe not the Ukraine themselves, but if the Russians block all exports of wheat from Ukraine and destroy the agricultural production system, the amount of wheat that we have there becomes much less, times 90% lower or zero. That means that we have to put this one to zero, and then the model will adjust that this trade flows will not take place. If the same demand consists existing here, so that is a quantity restriction, and that was your question. Can we implement quantity restrictions? So a quantity restriction is suddenly the harbor of Odessa in Ukraine is blocked and wheat cannot exit the country. Okay, what does it mean? Egypt and Lebanon, they are net importing countries of wheat. I just choose now two randomly. They are importers of wheat. They used to be supplied by Ukraine. What will they do now? People still have to eat. They like bread. They want to buy it. And then they look at, for instance, India and the European Union. That means that suddenly much more, this arrow will become much more bigger. So the trade flows from India will increase because this quantity restriction. If India then decides, and I don't remember if this was now really decided or not, or was it in the past, if India then decides, oh, that doesn't look good, we want to have food security in our country, we will also limit exports. Basically what they say is, no, we will not, we will block this, or we will block one of them, or we put a higher tariff. That means that this is not taking place. That means that more has to come from here. Now, if we have in each place not a quantity restriction, but a supply and a demand function, and with our shadow prices, we will be able to see what is then the resulting price here in Ukraine, where they cannot export anymore because the harbor is blocked. And indeed, from the context I had, the price of wheat is there 2 times lower now than in the rest of the world. Actually, I don't know what is the current rate with situation in India, but if India would have decided to block exports, then they disconnect themselves also from the rest of the world prices. If then more of the wheat from Europe is transported to these other countries, what will happen? Price of wheat in Europe goes up, and especially the price in those demand importing countries really increases. And then, of course, yeah, I know that you are really into, yeah, had done research in food security. That has a big impact on people, depending on buying food for their food security. And then as a country, if India, for instance, I don't know if this is the case, maybe somebody can write me in the chat if this is the case or not. If India would have limited exports of some of the cereals, yeah, India then can, yes, supply here to demand too. So it limits this arrow, it limits this arrow. More is going to India itself. And then if there's a price differentiation, and it protects the food security a bit more within the own country. I don't know, did this answer the question?
Yes, sir. But in case of trade, there are some non-trade barrier. Like in case of Indian tea, using of more than recommended doses of pesticides and germicides is one of the obligation against Indian tea. But these are from the viewpoint of experts. They said that it is non-tariff barrier. In case of econometrics model, we use dummy variables to capture this kind of non-tariff barriers. How can we capture these non-tariff barriers in this type of programming modeling?
Yeah, I agree. Because these quality controls, yeah, I have to admit, in that case, in some cases, it's less tangible. It's less easy to put quantitative numbers on that. And in that case, econometric models are in some cases better suited to look at this. So to see what is now the evolution of non-tariff barriers. On the other hand, if the control and the application of these non-tariff barriers remains constant over time, then you can still calibrate with observed price difference.
Yes.
So then you just observe, okay, there's a price difference between those two countries. There's no tariff that can explain it. Then it's an intangible non-tariff barrier. And yeah, to be honest, I really think that for a lot of countries to import in the EU, this is the case, because the EU for a lot of cases puts difficult standards to reach. So that could be a kind of non-tariff barrier. But if it doesn't change, then it's easy to simulate. However, what you also see in trade is that sometimes these non-tariff barriers are also, in some cases, they're also politically motivated. And in that case, if they change based on politics, so once controls are more strict, other times controls are less strict, then it's very difficult to simulate it with a mathematical programming model, and then you need to use either qualitative export knowledge or econometric approaches. More questions, comments?
Participants are requested to ask question to sir. If you have anything to ask, please unmute yourself and please ask. I think, sir, this is a new topic for them, and they need some time to understand this one. It's a really good one, new research topic for us all, and we will do research on these issues also.
Yeah, okay. You're not obliged. It's only in case it's interesting. But it's a very big group. I see that a lot of participants, 90 people.
Sir, actual participants are more than that, but unfortunately in India today is weather is very bad, and that is why some people are not able to connect it. So
okay.
connection problem is because
Is
of
there
that.
is there an overflow of rain at the moment
Yes, sir. It's heavily raining.
with flooding?
Flooding is common in some of in areas of India.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
it was a pleasure to us to listen you once again, particularly for me. I learned so many things from you, and no word is enough to say thank you to you. So
Thank
I
you
request,
for
yes, sir.
Thank you for attending and inviting me. If anybody is interested more in that topic, feel free to contact me. We can also think of setting up joint research projects in that case. By the way, I refer to here to commodities like sugar, wood, but you can also in some cases apply that to relatively local phenomena. And the most common application in my own research is, and that is not such a sexy topic, but it's transport of manure. And transport of manure, because it's bulky, can also be simulated with with this type of spatial price equilibrium model. So anyway, if somebody would be interested, feel free to contact me, and we can still further discuss that.
Then I took the opportunity to work with you once again. I am interested on this platform. I took this opportunity to say, and I hope this time you will reply me. I mail you, and I will wait for your reply to work together once again.
Okay, good. We stay in touch. Thank you.
Sir, it's time to say thank you in proper way, and I am not a competent person to say thank you. Maybe I am more emotional and forget to mention everything. I request team FDP to say properly for vote of thanks, please.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing the. What is it?
Such an insightful deliberation, sir, how mathematical programming can be used in management and policy analysis, and how trade can be used as a transport problem on the basis of spatial price equilibrium model. On behalf of my entire team, I'm immensely thankful to Professor Buysse for enlightening us on the concept. Thank you, sir. It's an honor to take the opportunity of expressing my gratitude to the patrons of Vidyasagar University and Assam University for extending their support for a collaborative FDP. I extend my gratitude to the advisory committee and also express my sincere thanks to the FDP chairman. I am also grateful to the course conveners for giving me the opportunity for being the session coordinator of the event. I take this occurrence to thank the entire team in the backend for putting up such a wonderful show. And I'm also thankful to all the participants for their patient hearing. Thank you once again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day.
You also.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, sir. Dipjyoti, sir.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. Please continue with that feedback form and others.
Yeah, and the next one will be at the scheduled time 6:30 only.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, participants. Let us meet again at 6:30.
Yes.